The January cold in DeKalb County, Illinois, has a particular quality that people from warmer places never quite understand. It does not simply lower the temperature. It presses down. It settles into the bones of the land and the bones of the men who work it, and it makes everything feel permanent, as though spring is not a season that will come again, but a rumor that old people tell to comfort themselves. On the afternoon of January 14th, 2008, Merle Douglas Keller drove his truck down a dirt road that had not been properly maintained in years. The frozen ruts grabbed at his tires. The fields on either side were bare and brown, the way all fields look in January, stripped of everything that made them worth looking at. He drove slowly, not because the road demanded it, though it did, but because he was preparing himself for what he was about to see. He had seen it once before 2 weeks earlier, just a quick drive past in the early morning. That had been enough to confirm the geological survey coordinates, but today was different. Today he was going to stand on it. Today he was going to make a decision that he had spent 5 years working toward, and he wanted to feel the ground beneath his feet before he committed to it. He parked at the edge of the field and sat in his truck for a moment with the engine running and the heat blowing against the cold windshield. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter. The field stretched away from the road in every direction, 47 acres of the most defeated-looking land he had ever seen. Water stood in the low areas, even though it had not rained in 11 days. The soil where it was visible was gray and compacted, the kind of color that soil turns when it has been asked to do too much for too long and has nothing left to give. There were no structures on the land, no barn, no equipment, shed nothing. Whatever Harlan Bowes had built here over the decades had been removed or had collapsed, leaving only the field itself, which looked like it had been waiting a long time for someone to simply let it rest. Merle turned off the engine and got out. The cold hit him immediately, a sharp, clean cold that smelled like frozen earth and the distant memory of last year's crops. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked to the edge of the field and stood there looking at it. His boots found the frozen mud at the boundary of the road and the land, and he stood still, just looking the way a man looks at something he has thought about for a very long time and is finally seeing with his own eyes. The field was broken. There was no other word for it. The drainage tiles that should have channeled water away from the surface had been failing for years, and the result was visible in the geography of the land itself, a series of low depressions where water collected and refused to leave, surrounded by slightly higher ground that had been compacted by decades of heavy machinery moving across wet soil. 3 years of failed crops had left the field without the root structure that would have helped hold the soil together. The surface had a gray, exhausted quality. If you were a farmer, and Merle was a farmer, everything you knew from 30 years of working the land told you the same thing: this field cannot be saved. He had walked fields like this before. He had made the same calculation that every other farmer in the county had made when they looked at this land. The cost of installing new drainage tile across 47 acres was prohibitive. The soil needed years of amendment before it would support a productive crop. The yield potential, even after significant investment, would likely never justify what you had put into it. It was the kind of math that was not complicated. You looked at the numbers, you looked at the land, and you moved on. Merle stood at the edge of the field for 20 minutes without moving. Then he drove to meet Harlan Bowes. Harlan lived 4 miles away in a farmhouse that had seen better decades. He was 71 years old, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had registered every winter he had ever worked through. He met Merle on the porch, and they shook hands, and Harlan led him inside to a kitchen table where 2 mugs of coffee were already waiting. The hospitality was automatic, the kind that rural Illinois men of a certain generation performed without thinking, because it was simply what you did when someone came to your house. They sat across from each other, and Harlan wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at Merle with eyes that were tired in a way that had nothing to do with that particular day. "I appreciate you coming out," Harlan said. "I appreciate you seeing me," Merle said. There was a pause. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees that lined Harlan's driveway, and the branches clicked against each other. Harlan said, "You saw the field." "I did." "Then you know what you're looking at." Merle said, "Tell me about it. The whole history, if you don't mind." Harlan looked at him for a moment, as though assessing whether Merle was the kind of man who asked questions in order to be polite, or the kind who asked because he actually wanted to know. He seemed to decide on the latter. "My grandfather bought that parcel in 1931, Harlan said. Depression-era purchase. Got it cheap because nobody else wanted it even then. He tried to farm it and had mixed results. Some years were decent, most weren't. He took a drink of his coffee. My father took it over in the 50s and put in the drainage tiles. That helped for a while. 10 years, maybe 15, the field produced okay, corn mostly. Then the tiles started failing and he couldn't afford to replace them all, so he replaced some and left the rest, and the water problems came back. He set his mug down and looked at the table. I took it over when Dad passed in 1978. I tried everything I could think of. Rented equipment and dug out 2 of the worst sections and put in new tile myself. It helped for 1 season and then the water came back. Had a soil scientist come out in 1985. He recommended deep tillage in a 3-year amendment program. I did it. Cost me more than I want to remember. 2 good seasons and then back to the same problems. Harlan was quiet for a moment. My grandfather used to call it the cursed 40, he said. My family called it that for 70 years. 3 generations of Beau's men spent time and money and faith on that land, and it never gave back what we put in. He looked up at Merle. I'm done with it. I just want it gone. Merle nodded slowly. He had come here with specific questions. He intended to ask methodical questions about drainage patterns and water movement and seasonal flooding behavior. But something in the way Harlan had said those last 6 words, the exhaustion in them, the weight of 70 years of family history settling into a simple declaration of defeat, made Merle set aside his prepared questions and ask the one that actually needed to be asked. Mr. Bowes, he said, I want to make an offer on the land, $3,000. I know the asking price was higher, and I know it's been reduced several times, and I know that's still not much. But I want to be straight with you about what I'm offering and why. Harlan looked at him without expression. The why doesn't matter much to me, Harlan said. At this point, I'd consider any serious offer. The why matters to me, Merle said. I'm not buying it to flip it. I'm not buying it because I think I can fix what your family couldn't fix. I'm buying it because I think the land is doing something that nobody has been looking for. Something underneath. Harlan studied him for a long moment. Whatever he was thinking, his face did not reveal it. Merle, he said, and the use of the first name carried something in it, a kind of plain rural directness that cut through the formality of the transaction. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as one farmer talking to another, not as a seller talking to a buyer. Merle waited. Don't buy it, Harlan said. I mean that. Whatever you think you see in that land, I've been looking at it my whole life and I don't see it. My father looked at it his whole life. My grandfather before him. 3 generations of men who knew land, who worked land, who understood land the way you and I understand it, and not one of us found what you're describing. He paused. I'm not saying this to kill the sale. I'm saying it because I'd feel like I was taking your money under false pretenses if I didn't. The 2 men looked at each other across the kitchen table. Merle thought about the geological survey folded in his jacket pocket. He thought about the USGS reports he had read and reread over 5 years in the County Extension Office Library. He thought about the aquifer maps and the infiltration data and the recharge zone analysis. He thought about everything that had brought him to this kitchen table on this cold January afternoon, and he thought about whether any of it was worth explaining to a man who had just told him not to buy. He decided it wasn't, not because he doubted himself, but because some things cannot be explained in a kitchen over coffee. Some things can only be demonstrated by time. I appreciate you telling me that, Merle said. I'm still going to make the offer if you're willing to accept it. Harlan looked at him for another long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has reached the end of his arguments and his energy both. $3,000, Harlan said. All right. They signed the papers at Harlan's kitchen table. Harlan's hand moved with the careful deliberateness that Merle had noticed before each signature, placed with the precision of a man who understood that this was the end of something that had run through his family for 70 years. When it was done, Harlan shook Merle's hand and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake requires. I hope you find what you're looking for, Harlan said. Merle drove away with the deed in his truck and the cold pressing down on everything. He did not drive home. 3 miles from Harlan's farmhouse, he pulled off the county road onto the gravel shoulder and stopped. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the geological survey for the 47-acre parcel. He unfolded it carefully, the paper soft with weeks of handling, and laid it across the steering wheel. He had first seen this document 6 weeks earlier in the County Extension Office Library, In the back section, where the geological and hydrological reports were kept in three-ring binders that most people never touched. He had been working through USGS surveys for the region systematically, the way he had been doing every Tuesday evening for 5 years, and this one had stopped him. Beneath the surface, problems that everyone could see beneath the failed drainage and the compacted soil and the standing water, the geological survey described something that the surface told no story about. A confined aquifer of exceptional quality, protected by layers of clay and sand that acted as a natural filtration system. The survey used words that Merle had read twice, then 3 times, then sat with in silence for a long time: exceptional water storage and purification potential, a critical recharge zone for the regional aquifer system. What the survey described in the measured technical language of geologists, who had no stake in whether anyone ever understood its significance, was a piece of land that was not failing at being a farm. It was succeeding at being something else entirely. Merle sat on the gravel shoulder with the deed in his truck and the survey in his hands and looked out at the flat gray fields of DeKalb County, Illinois, and allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite certainty, but was somewhere between the two. A small, quiet feeling that had taken 5 years to build. He folded the survey and put it back in his pocket. Then he drove home. Patsy was in the kitchen when he came through the back door, and the warmth of the house after the cold outside was immediate and physical. The way warmth always feels when you have been outside in a January, that means it. She looked up from the counter where she was working and registered something in his face, though she said nothing immediately. After 28 years of marriage, Patsy Keller had developed a sensitivity to the particular quality of her husband's silences that most people would not have recognized as a skill. "How was your day?" she asked. "Fine," Merle said. He hung his coat on the hook by the door and pulled off his boots. "Long drive, I'm going to wash up." He went upstairs and Patsy returned to what she'd been doing, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening. The deed was in the pocket of his coat on the hook by the door, one piece of paper among the ordinary objects of their life, and Merle said nothing about it. Not that evening, not the next day, not the following week. He did not explain his decision to his family. He did not justify it to anyone. He had made the purchase the way he had made the decision to spend 5 years reading geological reports alone quietly, without asking for permission or validation, because he had understood from the beginning that what he was doing was not the kind of thing that could be explained before it was proven. The deed remained in the coat pocket. Patsy found it 3 weeks later when she went through the mail one Thursday afternoon and found the property transfer documentation from the county recorder's office. She stood at the kitchen counter and read it carefully. The address, the parcel number, the transfer price $3,000, her husband's signature. She set the document on the kitchen table and waited for Merle to come in from the fields. When he came through the back door that evening and saw her sitting at the table with the paper in front of her, he understood immediately what had happened. He took off his boots and hung his coat and came to the table and sat down across from her. Patsy Keller was not a woman who raised her voice. In 28 years, Merle could count on one hand the times he had heard her shout, and none of them had been directed at him. Her method was different and in some ways more difficult to bear. She went very still and very direct, and she asked the question that went to the center of the thing, and she waited for the answer with a patience that made evasion feel actively shameful. She looked at him across the table. "Merle," she said, "did you not ask me because you didn't trust my judgment or because you knew I would say no?" He opened his mouth and found that he did not have an answer. Not because there was no answer, but because both options she had offered him were in different proportions, partially true, and he could not find a way to say that, which did not make him sound like a man who had decided his own certainty was worth more than his wife's voice in a decision that affected them both. He said nothing. Patsy looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the document on the table. "How much do we have left in the reserve account?" she asked. "Enough," Merle said. "It won't affect our operating budget." "That's not what I asked." He told her the number. She nodded once, the precise nod of a woman who is calculating something and does not want to show the calculation on her face. She did not cry. She did not argue. She folded the document and set it aside and got up and started dinner. And Merle sat at the table and understood that something had shifted between them, not broken, but shifted the way a floorboard shifts when it has been walked on in the same place too many times. The house felt the same. The sounds from the kitchen were the same. But something underneath had moved and they both knew it. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in mid-February, Merle asked Patsy if she wanted to see it. She agreed, and they drove out together in silence. The kind of silence that has a texture to it that is not comfortable but is not hostile, that is simply two people sitting with something unresolved between them and not yet knowing how to resolve it. They parked at the edge of the field and got out. Patsy stood at the boundary between the road and the land and looked at the 47 acres in front of her. The standing water in the low areas had frozen overnight and glinted dully in the flat February light. The soil was the gray of something that has given up. The native grasses that had established themselves in the absence of cultivation were brown and beaten down. She stood and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Merle stood beside her and did not try to explain it. He had learned in the weeks since she had found the deed that explanation was not what was needed. What was needed was for Patsy to see it herself, to form her own impression, to reach her own questions before he offered his answers. After a long time, she turned and walked back to the truck. Merle followed. They drove home mostly in silence, and it was only when they had turned back onto the county road that Patsy spoke. "How much money do you think this is going to cost us before it's finished?" she asked, not angry, simply factual the way she approached things that frightened her. Merle thought about the hydrogeologist he needed to hire, the monitoring wells he planned to install, the native vegetation program he had been designing in his notebooks for 2 years. "I don't know exactly," he said. "More than I paid for the land." Patsy looked out the window at the passing fields. "How much more?" she asked. He told her his best estimate. She received this information in silence. When they pulled into their driveway, she sat in the truck for a moment after he turned off the engine. "Merle," she said without looking at him, her eyes on the house in front of them, the house they had built together, the house where their daughter had grown up. "I need you to understand something. I'm not going to fight you on this, but I need you to understand that I am frightened, and I need you to understand why." He waited. "We have one farm," she said, "one operation, one income. We are not young. If this doesn't work, we don't have time to recover. And you have never in 28 years made a decision this size without talking to me first." She paused. "That's what frightens me. Not the land, the fact that you didn't ask." Merle sat with that for a moment. He thought about the Tuesday evenings in the library, the years of reading that nobody knew about, the slow accumulation of understanding that had felt at the time like his own private preparation for something he could not yet name. He thought about how it had never occurred to him to share that process because it had been so quiet, so interior, so entirely his own. He thought about how, in trying to be certain enough before he spoke, he had waited too long. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you earlier. I should have shown you what I was reading, what I was thinking. I handled this wrong." Patsy turned and looked at him then, and something in her face shifted slightly, the way it does when a person has braced for one thing and received another. She got out of the truck and went inside, and Merle sat alone in the cab for a moment longer, looking at the house, understanding that he had been given something by her honesty and that he had responded to it honestly in return, and that this was the beginning, not the end of a much longer conversation. He reached into the glove compartment and took out the geological survey. He looked at it for a moment, at the words he had read so many times they had worn grooves in his memory. Exceptional, purification, potential. He folded it and put it back. Then he went inside where his wife was in the kitchen, and the house was warm against the January cold, and the 47 acres of land that nobody in DeKalb County wanted sat 3 miles away, holding its secret quietly beneath the frozen ground, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. What Merle understood, in a way that he could not yet prove to anyone who had not spent 5 years reading what he had read, was that the land was not broken. It had never been broken. It had been doing something specific and consistent and valuable for as long as it had existed, something that had nothing to do with commodity crops or annual yields, or the calculations that farmers made to determine whether a piece of land was worth keeping. The drainage problem was not a problem. The drainage problem was the entire point. Water entered the field through the low areas where it pooled, moved through the soil profile at a rate that removed contaminants and impurities, and reached the confined aquifer below in a state that was cleaner than what had entered at the surface. Every farmer who had walked this field had been measuring its capacity to support crops and finding it wanting and moving on. What they had not known to measure was its capacity to do something that no crop could do: take degraded groundwater and return it clean. Merle had understood this sitting alone in the county extension office library on a Tuesday evening in 2006, reading a USGS report that had been sitting on that shelf for 4 years without anyone taking it down. He had understood it the way you understand things that are simultaneously very simple and very large, not all at once, but in a series of recognitions, each one building on the last until you arrive at a conclusion that feels in retrospect inevitable. He had not told Patsy about those evenings. He had gone to the library and read and come home and said nothing, and Patsy, who trusted him, had not pressed him on it. He had been carrying this thing alone for 5 years, not out of secrecy, but out of the particular caution of a man who has learned that telling people what you believe before you can prove it invites the kind of doubt that is difficult to withstand once it takes root. He understood now, sitting in his truck in his own driveway, that the caution had cost him something. He had protected himself from doubt by keeping Patsy outside of the process, and in doing so, he had made a decision that should have been theirs into a decision that was only his, and she had every right to be frightened by that. The truck cab was cold now. Merle could see the light on in the kitchen through the window and Patsy's shape moving behind the glass. He picked up the geological survey one more time. In the margin in his own handwriting from 2 years earlier, he had written 4 words that had felt at the time like the distillation of everything he had been reading. Water is the asset. He sat with those words for a moment in the cold. Then he went inside. Nobody talks about what it costs a man to be right too early. They talk about the vindication. They talk about the moment the world comes around, the handshakes and the recognition and the quiet satisfaction of having held your position when everyone around you was telling you to let it go. But they rarely talk about the years before that moment. The years when you are carrying something real and true and important, and the weight of it is yours alone, and there is no one to help you hold it. Merle Keller entered those years in the spring of 2008, and he would not leave them for a long time. The first thing he did after buying the field was hire Dr. Connie Falk. She was 34 years old, a hydrogeologist out of Champaign who had spent the previous 6 years doing groundwater assessments for municipal water systems and agricultural operations across central Illinois. She came with a clipboard and a professional skepticism that she did not bother to conceal because in her experience, farmers who called hydrogeologists usually had one of 2 problems. They had too much water where they did not want it or too little where they did. Merle Keller appeared to have the first problem, which was in her estimation the more straightforward of the 2. They walked the field on a cool April morning, the ground soft enough now that their boots left impressions in the soil. Merle walked her through the low areas where water still stood. After weeks of dry weather showed her the damaged drainage tiles that previous owners had partially repaired and partially abandoned, pointed out the variation in soil color and texture across different sections of the field. Dr. Falk took notes. She asked precise clinical questions. How long had the water been standing in this area? What was the approximate depth of the compacted layer? Had any soil samples been taken in the past decade? Merle answered each question with the same level of precision. He had been preparing for this conversation for 2 years. When they reached the center of the field, where the lowest depression collected the most water, Dr. Falk stopped and looked around at the surrounding terrain. She had the expression of someone who is beginning to suspect that the problem in front of her is not quite the problem she was hired to solve. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Mr. Keller?" she asked. "Most landowners in this situation want to improve drainage. You haven't mentioned drainage once this morning." Merle looked at the standing water. "I don't want to improve the drainage," he said. "I want to understand it, and then I want to make it work better than it already does." Dr. Falk looked at him. "Better at draining, better at infiltrating," Merle said. "I want to understand how water moves through this soil profile and reaches the aquifer below, and I want to find out if there are ways to make that process more efficient." There was a silence. A red-winged blackbird called from somewhere in the brush at the field's edge, the first one Merle had heard that spring. "You're talking about managed aquifer recharge," Dr. Falk said slowly in the tone of someone who has just identified a species they did not expect to find in this particular habitat. "Yes," Merle said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Where did you read about that?" "County Extension Office Library," Merle said. "USGS reports, groundwater surveys. I've been reading for about 5 years." Dr. Falk looked back at the standing water. Something had shifted in her posture, a subtle realignment from the professional efficiency she had arrived with towards something more genuinely engaged. She was, Merle would later understand, the kind of scientist who became more interested when a problem turned out to be more interesting than advertised. I'll need to run a full infiltration study, she said. Soil permeability at multiple depths, water table measurements, seasonal fluctuation documentation. It's going to take most of the summer, and it's going to cost you. I know, Merle said. About as much as you paid for the land. I know that too. She studied him for another moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook and closed it. I'll send you a proposal by the end of the week, she said. Merle drove home that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and wrote in his own notebook, the one he had been keeping since 2004, the one that now had 2 years of geological survey notes and aquifer data and carefully cross-referenced USGS documentation. He wrote April 14th, 2008. Hired Dr. Falk. Study begins in 2 weeks. The field is beginning. Patsy came in from the garden and saw him writing and said nothing. She had developed in the 2 months since finding the deed a particular kind of watchful quiet around the subject of the 47 acres. Not hostile, not supportive, simply watchful the way a person watches a situation they cannot yet evaluate. The summer of 2008 belonged to Dr. Falk and her equipment. She came twice a week through June and July, sometimes with an assistant, sometimes alone, always with instruments that Merle did not have names for and quickly learned. Permeameters that measured how fast water moved through soil. Piezometers installed in shallow wells that tracked water table depth. Soil sampling equipment that pulled cores from 12 feet down and laid them on trays for examination. Merle walked with her when she would allow it, which was most of the time, because she had discovered that he was one of those rare landowners who asked good questions and then listened to the answers. He learned the vocabulary of what she was doing, not as an academic exercise, but as a practical tool, the way he had learned the vocabulary of soil chemistry decades earlier, because understanding the language was the same as understanding the land. One afternoon in late July, Dr. Falk called him over to where she was examining a soil core laid flat on the sample tray. She pointed to the band of fine sand running between the clay layers. The water isn't stuck, she said. It's waiting its turn. This sand layer moves water down fast once pressure builds through the clay above. By the time it reaches the aquifer, it has been cleaned by passage through 3 distinct zones. She paused. Mr. Keller, you would pay millions of dollars to engineer this artificially. Merle had read the geological description of these layers many times. But hearing the conclusion stated plainly by someone who had just pulled the evidence out of the ground with her own hands was a different order of confirmation. He felt the particular satisfaction of a long calculation finally verified. How's the infiltration rate? He asked. Higher than anything I've seen in this county, she said, which is exactly why the surface floods the way it does. That evening, Merle wrote 4 lines in his notebook. Not analysis, not data, just 4 lines that recorded the fact of what he had felt standing in that field, the sensation of 5 years of reading, resolving into physical reality beneath his feet. He was not a man who recorded feelings often. He recorded this one because he understood even then that there would be times in the years ahead when he would need to come back to it. June turned to August, and August brought something that Merle had not anticipated. His neighbor, Cleet Warfield, had been watching the field all summer. Cleet was 58, a corn and soybean farmer who had worked the land adjacent to Merle's worthless 47 acres for 20 years. He was not an unkind man. He was a practical one, which in the farming culture of DeKalb County, Illinois, amounted to the same thing. And what practical men do when something strange is happening on the land next to theirs is ask about it. He found Merle at the field's edge one afternoon in early August, watching Dr. Falk's assistant move between monitoring wells. Merle, Cleet said, leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed. What exactly is going on over here? Merle said, I'm managing water. Cleet looked at the monitoring wells, the flag sample points, the woman with the instruments moving methodically across the field. Managing it to do what? To get where it's going more efficiently. Cleet's expression shifted towards something between confusion and mild concern, the expression of a practical man encountering something that does not fit his categories. You've got 47 acres here that haven't produced a bushel of anything this whole season. You've got a scientist out here twice a week. You've got wells in the ground that aren't pulling water, they're just measuring it. He paused. That's a lot of investment in a field that isn't giving you anything back. It's giving me data, Merle said. Data doesn't pay the bank. No, Merle agreed, not yet. Cleet shook his head slowly. What does Patsy think about all this? It was a question that struck closer than Cleet likely intended, because it contained in its casual neighborly concern the specific anxiety that had been living in Merle's house since January. He thought about Patsy's watchful quiet, the reserve account she had asked about, the way she had started keeping her own records of what was being spent. Patsy's managing, Merle said. Cleet looked at him for another moment, the way men look at each other when they know something is not being fully said and they are deciding whether to press it. You know, I'm not trying to get in your business, Cleet said. I know. I just don't understand what you're doing. And when I don't understand something happening on the land next to mine, I get a little worried. Merle looked at him directly. Cleet, the water that moves through my field goes down, not sideways. Your drainage isn't affected. Your water table isn't affected. What happens on this field stays below it. Cleet accepted this. He nodded and pushed off from the fence post and walked back to his own land. And Merle watched him go and understood that this conversation was not finished. It had only paused. 3 weeks later, Cleet organized a gathering. He did not call it a meeting. He called it a Saturday afternoon at his place, which was a distinction without a difference in rural Illinois, because a Saturday afternoon at Cleet Warfield's place meant 6 or 7 men sitting in the farm shop with coffee and the kind of conversation that was always more pointed than the casual invitation suggested. Merle was not invited. He found out about it 2 days later, when his neighbor on the south side, an older man named Orville Strand, stopped by to return a tire iron he had borrowed in June and mentioned it in the way that people mention things they think the relevant party should know. Cleet had some of the boys over Saturday, Orville said, handing back the tire iron. They were talking about your field, about the drainage, about whether what you're doing over there is going to cause problems for anybody else. Merle received this information without visible reaction. Was there a conclusion, he asked. Orville looked uncomfortable. Not a formal one, mostly just questions. Cleet thinks you've made a bad investment, and he's worried you're going to double down on it in ways that affect the water table for the rest of us. He paused. I told him I didn't think you'd do anything that hurt your neighbors, but I thought you should know what's being said. Merle thanked him and went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open in front of him and did not write anything for a long time. He was not angry. He was something more complicated than angry. The particular feeling of a man who has accepted isolation as the price of his conviction and is only now beginning to understand how high that price is. He had known that his neighbors would not understand what he was doing. He had known that the absence of a commodity crop would read to men who measured land by what it produced as failure or madness, or both. What he had not fully accounted for was the community dimension of that misunderstanding. He had not considered that his neighbors, watching something they did not understand happening on land adjacent to theirs, would begin to organize their concern. He had not considered that the isolation of his conviction would extend outward into his relationships, into the fabric of the community he had lived and worked in for 30 years. That evening, he did something he had not done in the 8 months since buying the field. He sat down with Patsy and told her everything. Not the summary, not the reassurance, everything. He started with the Tuesday evenings in the library in 2003, the first USGS report he had pulled off the shelf by accident, the slow accumulation of understanding across 5 years of reading. He told her about the geological survey and what it described beneath the field's problematic surface. He explained what managed aquifer recharge meant and why it mattered for a region where the groundwater was in measurable documented decline. He talked for a long time. Patsy listened without interrupting, which was one of her particular gifts, the ability to receive information completely before responding to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you tell me this before you bought it? She said. Because I was afraid you would find a flaw in my reasoning, he said, which was more honest than he had intended to be. Patsy looked at him. And now I'm more afraid of carrying it alone than of you finding a flaw. She was quiet again. Outside, the late summer dark had settled fully over the county, and the only sound was the distant machinery of a neighbor harvesting his corn. I don't fully understand all of it, Patsy said finally. The geology, the aquifer. I would need to read what you've read. I can show you, Merle said. She looked at him for a moment. Cleet Warfield thinks you've lost your mind. Cleet Warfield has never read a USGS groundwater report. Something moved across Patsy's face. It was not a smile exactly, but it was in the neighborhood of one. Show me the notebooks, she said. He brought the notebooks to the table, 4 of them now, 5 years of carefully documented reading and thinking. Patsy opened the first one and began to read. Merle made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table past midnight. Patsy reading, Merle answering questions, the field sitting 3 miles away, in the dark, doing quietly what it had always done. It was not resolution, but it was for the first time since January the beginning of something that might become it. The financial crisis arrived that fall like a second weather system moving in behind the first. The collapse of the credit markets in September and October of 2008 hit agricultural communities in the particular way that financial crises always hit people who work on thin margins. It did not create new problems, so much as it made existing problems impossible to defer. Commodity prices fell, input costs remained high, lines of credit tightened. Banks that had been willing to extend flexibility began asking harder questions. Merle's primary operation, the corn and soybean acreage that he had been farming for 30 years, had always run on margins that left little room for error. He was not a bad farmer. He was a good farmer in an industry where being a good farmer was not sufficient protection against the structural economics of commodity agriculture. The crisis of 2008 compressed those margins further, and by the spring of 2009, breaking even required a level of precision in every decision that left no room for thinking that was not directly connected to the next harvest. The 47 acres produced nothing. Merle continued to manage it. He removed sections of the damaged drainage tile not to improve drainage in the agricultural sense, but to allow water to spread more naturally across the low areas and increase infiltration. He began establishing native vegetation, the sedges and willows, and wet prairie species that would hold the soil at the water's edge and slow the movement of surface water enough to improve percolation. He planted them himself on weekends and evenings because he could not afford to hire help for work that had no commodity output. His brother Gordy called from Iowa in February of 2009. Gordy was 3 years older and had spent his entire adult life farming in Lynn County, a practical man in the fullest sense of the word, the kind of man who evaluated every decision by its likely return and moved through the world with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for anything that did not contribute directly to a measurable outcome. He called approximately 4 times a year, always with the tone of a man who is fulfilling an obligation he takes seriously, if not enthusiastically. "Merle," Gordy said without preliminary, "I heard you bought a piece of land that doesn't produce anything." Merle was in the kitchen. Patsy was in the next room, and he was aware of her awareness of the conversation. "It produces water," Merle said. There was a pause from Iowa. Gordy Merle said, "The region is losing groundwater. I'm restoring a natural system that recharges the aquifer. It's documented in the USGS data. I can send you the reports." "Merle," Gordy said with the particular wariness of an older brother who has been patient for a long time. "We are in the middle of a financial crisis. Commodity prices are down. Banks are foreclosing on operations across the Midwest, and you're spending money on a field that produces something you can't sell." "Not yet," Merle said. "That's not a business plan. That's a wish." Gordy did not want to read the reports. Merle had known he would not. The conversation ended shortly after, with the particular unsatisfying conclusion of 2 brothers who love each other and cannot reach each other across the distance of different ways of seeing. The call Merle had not anticipated came 2 weeks later from his mother. She was 78, living in the house in Rockford where Merle and Gordy had grown up, and she called on Sunday afternoons with the regularity of someone who had decided that regular contact was an expression of love worth maintaining regardless of what there was to talk about. She asked about Patsy. She asked about Dina. Then she asked with the directness of a woman who had always believed that indirectness was a form of disrespect about the land. "Gordy says you're having some trouble," she said. "Gordy worries," Merle said. "He says you're putting money into land that doesn't produce. It produces something that doesn't have a market price yet." His mother was quiet for a moment. "Merle," she said, and her use of his full name carried the specific weight that mothers give it when they are about to say something they have thought about carefully. "You have always been the one in this family who thought differently. When you were a boy, your father used to say you saw things sideways. He meant it as a criticism. I never thought it was." Merle said nothing. "But I want you to promise me something," she said. "I want you to promise me that Patsy is with you on this, not just tolerating it, with you." He thought about the midnight at the kitchen table, the notebook spread between them, the coffee going cold. "She's learning the material," he said. "That's not the same as being with you." "No," he agreed, "but it's the direction." His mother accepted this not because it was fully satisfying, but because she understood, as she had always understood about her younger son, that there were things he was working toward that he could not fully explain until he arrived. The spring and warmer of 2009 passed. Merle's operation broke even for the year, which under the circumstances was a form of success, but it left nothing over for the 47 acres beyond what he had already budgeted. The field was beginning to look different. The low areas, which had previously been bare mud, were filling in with the green of native plants. The sedges especially were thriving, their roots binding the soil at the water's edge. Dr. Falk visited twice that season. On the second visit in late August, she stood at the edge of the Central Depression and looked at what Merle had planted and said simply, "It's working." He knew it was working, he had the data, but hearing her say it was different. Thanksgiving came and with it Dina. She was 20 years old now, in her second year at the University of Illinois, studying environmental science, and she had inherited from her father the quality of close attention, though she directed it toward different things. She came home on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and set her bag down in her room and asked almost before she had taken off her coat if she could see the field. Merle drove her out on Thursday morning before the rest of the family arrived for dinner. They walked through the field together, and Dina moved through it the way she moved through her coursework methodically and with genuine curiosity, crouching to examine the native plants, looking at the monitoring well data Merle had brought in his notebook, asking questions that demonstrated she had been paying more attention to his dinner table explanations than he had realized. At the center of the field where the vegetation was thickest, she stood up and looked around at what her father had built over the past 2 years. "Dad," she said, and there was something in her own voice that he had not heard from his daughter in relation to this work before, not doubt, not worry, but recognition. "Do you know what this looks like? In my wetland ecology class, we studied restoration projects that cost the state hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement. This is the same thing. You've done this yourself." Merle looked at her. "I've just been helping the land do what it wants to do," he said. Dina looked at him steadily, the way her mother looked at him when she was processing something that mattered. "You've been doing this for 2 years and nobody knows about it." "You know about it," he said. She shook her head, but not in disagreement, in something more like wonder. That evening, driving home from the field in the cold November dark, Merle wrote one line in his notebook before dinner. November 27th, 2009. "Today, Dina saw it. I am no longer the only one." The winter of 2010 brought a change that nobody outside Merle's notebook would have recognized as significant. He installed 6 observation wells across the field in February. Simple PVC pipes, driven to different depths, capped with locking covers marked with numbered stakes. He measured them monthly, always on the first Sunday, recording the numbers in a dedicated section of his 5th notebook. By June, the pattern was unmistakable. The aquifer beneath his 47 acres was receiving more water than it had in years. The months of native vegetation establishment, the removal of the drainage tiles that had been channeling water away before it could infiltrate the restored connectivity between the surface and the soil profile below, all of it was producing a measurable result. He also began water quality monitoring that year, hiring a laboratory in Rockford to analyze samples quarterly. The results told a consistent story. Water entering the field at the surface carried the signature of agricultural runoff. Water sampled from the deeper monitoring wells showed a different signature. The filtration was working. He documented all of it. He filled his 5th notebook and started a 6th. He built across those months a complete scientific record of what his field was doing, documented with the rigor of a man who understood that the day would come when he would need to prove it. But that day had not come yet. And in the meantime, the bank had begun to ask questions. Sid Hauer had been the loan officer at the DeKalb County Farmers Bank for 19 years. He was a careful man, not unkind, who had worked with Merle Keller's account for 12 of those 19 years, and had always found him to be a sound borrower. The 47 acres was creating a different impression. Sid called in December of 2010, and Merle drove to the bank on a cold afternoon to sit across a desk from a man he had known for a decade and answer questions he had been expecting. "I want to understand the 47-acre parcel," Sid said. "We've had it in your file for 3 years, no income, ongoing management costs, and I can't find a conventional use category for what you're doing out there." Merle explained it: aquifer recharge, water quality restoration, long-term resource value in a region experiencing measurable groundwater depletion. Sid listened carefully. When Merle finished, Sid looked at the folder again. "Merle," he said, "from where I sit, what I have is a piece of land with no production income and no market value that I can document. In a conventional appraisal, that parcel is worth what you paid for it, maybe less. I can't use it as collateral. And I need you to understand that your overall financial position is going to require attention in the next 12 months. Merle drove home from that meeting in a particular silence, the silence of a man who has encountered the limits of a system that was not built to measure what he is building. He sat at the kitchen table that evening, and Patsy sat across from him. Howard can't value the field, Merle said. Patsy nodded. She had expected this. Merle, she said, using his name, the way she used it when something serious required saying plainly, I need to ask you again. Not because I don't believe in the work. I've read the notebooks. I understand what you're doing out there. But I need to know, are you certain enough in this to carry the risk for another year? Merle looked at his hands on the table. I'm certain the aquifer is being recharged, he said. I'm certain the water quality data shows what I say it shows. I'm certain that the regional groundwater is in decline and that this field is doing something that matters. He paused. What I'm not certain of is when anyone else will recognize it. Patsy was quiet for a moment. What would make them recognize it? A drought, he said. A real one. When the wells start failing and the water table drops everywhere else, this field will stand out in the monitoring data. Someone will notice. She was quiet again for a long time. Outside, December had settled its full weight on DeKalb County, and the frozen fields extended in every direction under a sky with no stars. All right, Patsy said. She did not say she believed him. She did not say she had stopped being frightened. She said all right, which in the language of their marriage meant, I am still here, I am still with you, and I am choosing to continue choosing that. It was not the unconditional endorsement that Merle might have wished for. It was something more durable than that. He reached across the table and put his hand on hers, and she did not pull away. In the spring of 2011, something changed in the weather data that Merle had been watching with quiet attention for 2 years. The snowpack in northern Illinois had come in low that winter, lower than any year in the previous decade. The spring rains were sparse and poorly timed. The summer forecast models, when he pulled them up at the county extension office in April, showed a pattern that matched the drought scenarios the USGS regional reports had identified as the highest risk case for aquifer depletion. Merle drove home and told Patsy that he thought the drought was coming. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the steadiness that had come to characterize her relationship to the project. How sure are you? She asked. Sure enough that I want to expand the vegetation program this summer and install 2 more monitoring wells before fall. Patsy picked up her coffee cup and looked at it for a moment. Then we better get started, she said. What neither of them knew sitting at their kitchen table in the spring of 2011 was that the drought had already begun. Not visibly, not yet, but in the slow, patient mathematics of water moving through soil and stone, in the declining numbers that Merle's monitoring wells were recording month by month, in the aquifer data that the Illinois Department of Natural Resources was tracking on instruments that no farmer in DeKalb County had ever looked at, the drought of 2012 was already writing its first lines. And beneath Merle Keller's 47 acres, the field was already preparing its answer. The summer of 2012 did not arrive. It descended. There was no gradual warming, no gentle transition from the mild days of late spring into the heat of July. Instead, the temperature climbed in the first week of June and stayed there, pressing down on the flat agricultural landscape of northern Illinois with a consistency that felt less like weather and more like a decision. The corn that had been planted in May stood in rows that grew shorter and more stressed with each passing week. The soybean fields began to show the particular curl of leaves that farmers recognize before they let themselves name what they are seeing. The rain did not come. Merle had watched the monitoring wells through May and into June, recording numbers that confirmed what the weather data had been suggesting since the previous fall. The water table was dropping. Not catastrophically, not yet, but with a steady downward movement that matched the models he had studied. He recorded each measurement in his notebook, with the same handwriting he had used for 4 years, the same deliberate documentation. But the numbers themselves carried a weight that the earlier entries had not. He was watching the drought arrive the way a man watches a storm he saw forming on the horizon hours earlier. He was not surprised. But knowing something is coming does not make it easier to watch it come. By the 3rd week of July, the word drought had moved from the weather forecasts into the daily conversation of every farming community in the Midwest. The USDA was beginning the formal process of disaster designation. The numbers being reported in the agricultural press were the kind of numbers that farmers read twice before accepting the worst drought in 53 years. Corn yields projected to fall by 30% or more across the region. Irrigation wells operating at capacity and in some areas beginning to show pressure drops. Merle drove the county roads in the evenings and saw what the drought was doing to the land around him. The fields had a desiccated quality, a brown that was not the healthy brown of harvest, but the defeated brown of crops that had given up before their time. The ditches that normally carried excess water were dry. The ponds that cattle drank from were shrinking visibly from week to week, their banks extending outward in rings of dried mud. He drove past Cleet Warfield's operation on a Tuesday evening in late July and saw Cleet standing in his cornfield, halfway down a row looking at the plants around him with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that keeps producing the wrong answer. Merle slowed the truck but did not stop. Cleet did not look up. 2 days later, Cleet came to Merle's door. He came in the late afternoon when the heat had not yet released its grip on the day, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands in the particular posture of a man who has decided to do something difficult and is not going to let himself reconsider it at the last moment. Merle opened the door and looked at him. "My well is gone," Cleet said. There was no preamble. In the farming culture, they both inhabited a man in genuine trouble did not circle around it. "Dropped to nothing yesterday morning. Driller says he can't get out here for 3 weeks minimum. Every driller in 3 counties is backed up." Merle waited. "My cattle need water," Cleet said. "My wife needs water. I've got a household and a herd and nothing coming out of the ground." He paused, and the pause contained everything that he was not saying: the years of skepticism the Saturday afternoon at his farm shop, the look on his face when Merle had explained what he was doing and Cleet had shaken his head. "I know I said some things about your field that weren't fair. I'm not here to pretend I didn't say them. I'm here because you're my neighbor and I need help." Merle looked at him for a moment. He thought about several things he could have said. He said none of them. "Come around back," he said. "I'll show you what we can set up." They walked to the field together in the late afternoon heat, and Merle showed Cleet the monitoring well in the northeastern corner. One closest to Cleet's property line, the one where the water table readings had been consistently strongest throughout the drought. He explained what could be done: a temporary pump connection that would draw from the shallow zone above the confined aquifer enough for livestock and household use without stressing the deeper system. Cleet stood and listened. He was a man who understood practical hydraulics, who had been managing wells and pumps his entire adult life, and he grasped what Merle was describing without needing it over-explained. "How much will this affect your aquifer?" Cleet asked. The question surprised Merle not because it was wrong, but because it was right. It was the question of a man who had been paying attention even when he appeared not to be. "At the volume you need minimal," Merle said. "The recharge rate in this system can sustain what you're asking for. That's the point of everything I've been doing out here for 4 years." Cleet looked out across the field. The native vegetation was established now thick and green in ways that stood in stark contrast to the brown fields visible in every other direction. The low areas where water had once pooled uselessly were now dense with sedges and wet prairie plants, their roots deep in soil that had been gradually transformed from compacted and exhausted to something with structure and life. Cleet looked at all of it for a long time. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me nothing," Merle said. "Let's get your cattle watered." They worked together for the rest of that afternoon, and when the water flowed through the connection and Cleet's cattle pushed toward the trough, both men stood and watched without speaking. There was nothing that needed to be said. The water said it. That evening, Merle sat on the porch until dark and thought about the fact that the first person to benefit from 4 years of his work had been the neighbor who had thought him foolish for doing it. He did not find this ironic. He found it in some way he could not fully articulate exactly right. Dr. Warren Pruitt did not arrive because anyone called him. He arrived because of a number. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources Groundwater Monitoring Network covered the state through a system of observation wells that fed data to a central database in Springfield. Pruitt was a senior hydrologist with 20 years of experience reading that data, and he reviewed it weekly the way some men review the sports scores, not out of obligation, but because it was the thing he genuinely cared about most. In the 3rd week of August 2012, a data point appeared in the DeKalb County sector that made him stop. While every other monitoring station in the region was recording water table drops of 8 to 12 feet, one cluster of readings in the northeastern part of the county showed a drop of only 3 feet over the same period. The readings had been consistent for months. They were not an instrument error. They were real, and they were anomalous in a way that Pruitt had not seen in 20 years of watching Northern Illinois groundwater data. He pulled up the parcel maps for that location and found the property owner. He called the county extension office. He made 2 more calls. Then he drove to DeKalb County on a Tuesday morning in late August alone with his field instruments and a notebook to find out what was happening on a piece of land owned by a farmer named Merle Keller. Merle was in the field when the state vehicle pulled onto the access road. He saw it coming and waited, recognizing the agency insignia without knowing specifically who was inside. When Pruitt got out and introduced himself, Merle shook his hand and said nothing about having been waiting in some form for this visit for 4 years. Pruitt was direct in the way that scientists who have spent 2 decades in fieldwork become direct. No unnecessary conversation. Clear questions, a quality of attention that was fully present. He wanted to see everything. The monitoring wells, the vegetation program, the soil profile data, the water quality laboratory results. They walked the field for 4 hours. Merle had walked this land hundreds of times. He knew every monitoring well by its number, every vegetation zone by what he had planted there and when. But walking it with Pruitt was different from walking it alone because Pruitt was reading the field the way Merle read his notebooks, systematically connecting each piece of evidence to the next building toward a conclusion with the patient methodology of a man who had learned not to arrive at his conclusions before the evidence was complete. At the central depression, where the native vegetation was thickest and the infiltration rates highest, Pruitt crouched down and looked at the soil at the water's edge. He pressed 2 fingers into the mud and felt the texture. He stood up and looked at the monitoring well data that Merle had handed him on a clipboard and was quiet for a long time. "How long have you been managing this system?" he asked. 4 years of active management, Merle said. The reading and planning before that goes back to 2003. Pruitt looked up from the clipboard. "You started planning this in 2003. I started reading the aquifer data in 2003, Merle said. "I bought the land in 2008. Pruitt looked at him in the way that scientists look at something that does not fit their expectation of where expertise is supposed to come from. Then, he returned to the data. They stood at the highest point of the field in the late afternoon, looking out across the surrounding landscape. In every direction, the drought had written its signature on the land-brown fields, dry ditches, the distant evidence of stressed crops and declining ponds. And here, 47 acres of native vegetation, green and established, sitting above an aquifer that had held its level while everything around it fell. Pruitt stood with his hands at his sides and looked at it for a long time. "Do you understand what you've created here?" he said. His voice had changed. The clinical efficiency was still there, but underneath it, something else had entered, the particular quality of a scientist who is found in the field, something that exceeds what the data had prepared him for. "A recharge system," Merle said. "A managed one." "More than that," Pruitt said. He turned to look at Merle directly. "We have been documenting aquifer decline in this region for 11 years. The rate of depletion has been accelerating. We have models that project when critical thresholds will be crossed, when municipal systems will begin to experience supply stress, when agricultural wells in certain areas will become unreliable." He paused. "What you have built here materially changes those projections for this part of the county. This field, properly managed, can sustain the water supply for approximately 3,000 people indefinitely." Merle received this in silence. "Do you know what that's worth?" Pruitt asked. "In resource value terms, I've seen projections around $25 million over the aquifer's productive lifetime," Merle said. Pruitt looked at him. "You already knew the number." "I calculated it from the USGS depletion data and the regional population figures," Merle said. "I needed someone to verify it." Something moved across Pruitt's face. It was not quite surprise, but it was adjacent to it, the expression of a man recalibrating. "You've been out here alone for 4 years, Pruitt said. "With this data, with these results, and nobody knew." "My wife knows," Merle said. "My daughter understands it. The hydrogeologist I hired verified the infiltration science." He paused. "And my neighbor has been drinking this water for the past 3 weeks." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back out at the field. "I need to bring a team here," he said. "University researchers, state water resources staff. This needs to be documented at a level beyond what you've been able to do alone." Merle nodded. "I'd welcome that," he said. The news moved through water resource agencies, steadily reaching further from the source as each layer passed it along. The DNR prepared a formal assessment. University of Illinois researchers requested access. Environmental organizations that had been documenting aquifer depletion across northern Illinois began to ask questions about the DeKalb County anomaly. By October of 2012, the field that Harlan Bowe's grandfather had called the Cursed 40 had become the subject of academic papers, state agency reports, and the kind of professional attention that once directed at something does not easily redirect. Merle's phone rang with a regularity that was entirely new and not entirely comfortable. He was not a man who had sought recognition. He was a man who had sought to solve a problem, and the recognition was arriving as a consequence of the solution, which was a different thing entirely. Patsy managed the calls with the organized efficiency she brought to everything, creating a simple log of who had called and what they wanted. She had transformed over the course of 2012 from a woman who tracked expenditures in a private notebook to a woman who understood with increasing depth exactly what her husband had built. The transition had been built from months of reading his notebooks and asking questions and sitting with Pruitt and the university researchers when they came to the farm. In October, she stood in the field for the first time since the cold February morning 4 years earlier, when Merle had brought her to see it and she had stood in silence and said nothing. The field she stood in now was not the same field. The native vegetation covered the low areas completely dense and varied the sedges and willows and wet prairie plants, knitted together into something that looked less like a managed agricultural operation and more like a landscape that had healed. The water table beneath the field was 11 feet higher than the regional average for the drought year. Patsy stood in the center of the field and looked around at what her husband had made. "You were right," she said. Merle shook his head. "I read the right reports at the right time, and I was patient." Patsy looked at him with the directness that had characterized her for the 30 years he had known her. "Merle, you were right." He accepted this. It seemed important to her that he accept it fully, without qualification, and he understood why. For 4 years, she had been the one person most completely inside the difficulty of the uncertainty, the one who had maintained the household budget through the lean years, the one who had kept her private accounting and her watchful quiet while he carried the conviction alone. She had earned the right to say it plainly, and he had earned the right to hear it. That evening, he called his brother Gordy. Gordy answered on the second ring with the brisk efficiency of a man who treated phone calls as tasks to be completed. Merle told him about Pruitt, about the university researchers, about the state assessment, about the 3,000 people whose water supply the field was now documented to sustain. He told it plainly without triumph, because triumph was not what he felt. What he felt was closer to relief, the particular relief of having carried something for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Gordy was quiet for longer than his usual rhythm. "Merle," he said finally, "I owe you an apology." "You were looking at it reasonably with the information you had," Merle said. "I wasn't," Gordy said. "I was looking at it the way I always look at things, and I dismissed what I didn't understand. That's not reasonable. That's just familiar." Another pause. "I'm proud of you." They talked for 40 minutes, the longest conversation they had had in years. And when Merle hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a moment with his hand on the phone. He thought about his mother's question from the winter of 2009, "Is Patsy with you?" He picked up the phone again and called Rockford. His mother answered, and he told her, and she listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she said with the simplicity of a woman who had been waiting for this specific call for 3 years, "I knew you'd figure it out, Merle. I always knew." In the spring of 2013, 3 municipalities in DeKalb County approached Merle about formal water partnership agreements. Environmental organizations offered grant funding to expand the recharge program to adjacent parcels. The state proposed a long-term management agreement that would provide annual funding in exchange for maintaining the field's function as a regional water resource. Merle and Patsy sat with the proposals at the kitchen table, the same table where so many of the difficult conversations of the previous 5 years had taken place. They read the documents carefully and asked questions of the lawyers and the water resource officials who came to explain them. The offers to purchase outright were significant. One came at a number that would have resolved every financial concern Merle had carried since 2008 and funded a comfortable retirement besides. He declined to sell. The reason he gave was straightforward. A recharge system requires continuous management. Management requires an owner who understands the system and is committed to its function. Selling transferred the decision-making to entities whose priorities might shift, whose relationship to the land was institutional rather than personal. He had spent 9 years learning this field. He was not willing to hand that knowledge to someone who would need years to learn it themselves, during which the field might be managed in ways that undid what he had built. Patsy agreed with this reasoning. She had helped develop it. They entered instead into a management partnership with the state retaining ownership while receiving operational support and formal recognition of the field's function as public water infrastructure. It meant the field stayed in their hands and the work continued. The summer of 2014 brought Cleet Warfield back to the field, this time not in need. He came on a Saturday morning and knocked on the door and asked if Merle had an hour. They drove out to the field together and walked along the eastern boundary, the one that ran alongside Cleet's property. And Cleet was quiet in the way he was always quiet when he was preparing to say something that required effort. They stopped at the corner where Cleet's land met Merle's. "I owe you more than I said in 2012, Cleet said. "I've been thinking about that for 2 years. I organized that shop meeting. I was the one telling people you'd lost your mind. I did real damage to how people thought about you in this county, and it wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." He looked at the ground for a moment. "I want you to know I understand that." Merle looked at his neighbor of 22 years. Cleet was 64 now, a little heavier, the gray in his hair more complete. He had the face of a man who had worked hard in all his life and was still working and did not expect it to be otherwise. "Cleet," Merle said, "you looked at this land and saw what any farmer would have seen. I'm not going to hold that against you." "I didn't just look," Cleet said. "I talked. There's a difference." Merle considered this. "Yes," he said, "there is." They stood at the fence line in the summer morning, and after a while, Cleet said, "My grandson is going into agricultural science in the fall. University of Illinois. He wants to come out and see this operation before he starts." "Bring him out," Merle said. "I'll walk him through everything." Cleet nodded. He put his hat back on and turned toward his truck, then stopped. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said without turning around. "I keep thinking about the fact that you knew. In 2008, when you bought that field, you already knew what it was, and you just waited for the rest of us to figure it out." He paused. "That takes something I don't think I have." He got in his truck and drove back to his own land, and Merle stood at the fence line for a moment longer, feeling the particular quality of a long arc finally completing itself. The young farmers began coming in 2016. Merle had not planned for this. It developed gradually through one conversation, then another, then a phone call from a county extension agent who had heard about the field and thought some of the younger operators in the region might benefit from seeing it. Merle said yes, and then yes again, and then found himself one Saturday morning in April, standing at the edge of his field with 8 young men and women in their 20s and early 30s, all of them carrying notebooks. He walked them through it the way he walked it himself, starting at the boundary, moving to the low areas, explaining the vegetation choices and what each species was doing in the soil, showing the monitoring well data and how to read it. He explained what it had told him about the aquifer beneath. He explained infiltration and recharge in terms that his years of reading had taught him to make accessible without losing the accuracy required. The young farmers asked good questions. They were a different generation from the men who had sat in Cleet Warfield's shop in 2008, and they came with different frameworks influenced by years of drought and water scarcity, news, and a growing awareness in agricultural circles that water was becoming the defining resource challenge of the coming decades. They did not find what Merle was doing strange. They found it instructive. At the end of the morning, a young woman named Becca, who farmed 300 acres of row crops in the next county and had driven 90 minutes to be there, asked him a question that stopped him. "Mr. Keller, when you bought this land in 2008, before you had any of the validation before Pruitt came before the drought, proved you right, what kept you going? Because I have a piece of land that I think has potential that nobody else can see, and I don't know how to hold on to that conviction when everyone around me thinks I'm wrong." Merle looked at her. He thought about the Tuesday evenings in the library and Loretta, who had named him the Waterman, and brought him the reports from the back shelves. He thought about the kitchen table conversations with Patsy in the worst years. He thought about Dina standing in the field on Thanksgiving morning and saying it looked like a textbook restoration project. He thought about Harlan Bose's hand in his at the kitchen table, the grip of a man releasing something that had weighed on his family for 70 years. "The data," he said. "I held on to the data, not the theory, not the idea, not the vision, the actual measurements. Every month I went to those wells and I recorded the numbers, and the numbers didn't change because I was having a hard year. The numbers were what they were. When you can go back to something real, something measured, something true, regardless of what anyone thinks about it, that's where you find the patience to keep going. Becca wrote this down. The others wrote it down too. Merle watched them writing and thought about his own notebooks. The 7 of them now stacked in order in the filing cabinet in his study, each one a year's worth of measurements and observations, and the occasional 4-line entry that recorded a feeling rather than a data point. And one other thing, he said, find someone who will read what you're reading. You don't have to convince them you're right. You just need someone who will learn the language with you. The isolation is the hardest part, not the skepticism from outside, the being alone with it on the inside. He thought of Patsy, who had opened the first notebook on a November evening and sat reading until 2 in the morning. In the fall of 2019, 11 years after the purchase of 47 acres for $3,000, Merle received a phone call from the son of Harlan Bowes. Harlan was 82 now and in poor health, living with his son outside Sycamore. He had heard about the field over the years in the way that rural communities transmit information about significant local events gradually and incompletely through conversations at the feed store, in the extension office, in the church social. He knew the broad outlines of what had happened on the land his grandfather had called the Cursed 40. His son called Merle to ask if Harlan might come out to see it one last time. Merle said yes without hesitation. They came on a Thursday morning in late September. Harlan's son driving a truck that Harlan rode in with the careful stillness of a man for whom movement had become an exercise in management. Merle met them at the field's edge and helped Harlan out of the truck, and they stood together looking at what the field had become. The native vegetation was fully established now, 11 years of growth creating a landscape that bore no resemblance to the gray compacted acreage that Harlan had spent his adult life trying and failing to farm. The monitoring wells stood at their stations. The water table beneath the field had fully recovered from the 2012 drought year and was running at the highest level documented in the 11 years of record keeping. Harlan stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at it for a long time. He was a man who had worked land his entire life, and the way he looked at the field was the way such men look at things not as scenery, but as systems reading the vegetation and the soil moisture and the drainage patterns with eyes trained by decades of observation. He turned to Merle. "I told you not to buy it," Harlan said. "You did," Merle said. "I was right," Harlan said with what I knew. "Yes," Merle said, "you were." Harlan looked back at the field. "My grandfather farmed this parcel for 40 years and thought it was cursed. My father farmed it for 30 years and thought it was broken. I farmed it for 20 years and thought it was hopeless." He was quiet for a moment. "It was never any of those things." "No," Merle said. "It was doing what it was built to do. We just didn't know how to see it." Harlan nodded slowly. He reached out and put his hand on Merle's arm, the grip of an old man whose hands remembered decades of work, and held it for a moment. "Thank you for saving it," Harlan said. Merle drove home that afternoon and went directly to his study and opened the filing cabinet and took out the first notebook. One from 2003, the year he had pulled the USGS report from the shelf at the Extension Office Library and read it by accident and felt for the first time the slow beginning of a conviction he could not yet name. He opened it to the first page and read the first entry written in his own handwriting on a Tuesday evening in October 2003, aquifer depletion in northern Illinois. Regional water table declining. Recharge zones identified but not protected. There may be an opportunity here that nobody's looking at. He turned to the last entry he had made from the previous Sunday, his most recent monitoring well measurements. The numbers were as they should be. The system was functioning. The water was moving through the soil the way it had always moved, the way it would continue to move long after Merle Keller was no longer there to record it. He took a pen and turned to a blank page at the back of the notebook. He wrote the date. Then he wrote Loretta that you called me the waterman. You put the reports on the desk for me when I came in on Tuesdays, and you never asked what I was looking for. I didn't know then how much that mattered. I know now. I wish you could see what grew from those Tuesday evenings. He set the pen down and closed the notebook and sat in his study in the quiet of the late September afternoon, the light coming through the window at the angle that meant the day was getting on. In the kitchen, Patsy was doing something that involved the particular domestic sounds of a house that is lived in, fully the movement of someone comfortable in their own space, the small sounds of a life continuing. Outside, 3 miles away, the field is sat in the late afternoon light. The native grass is moving in a slow wind, the monitoring wells standing at their stations, the water moving through the soil profile in the patient dark beneath the surface, doing what it had always done. Not because anyone was watching, not because it had been proven valuable, simply because it was the nature of water to move toward where it was needed to filter through what stood between it and where it was going to arrive cleaner than it had begun. Merle had not taught the land anything. He had learned to stop insisting it be something other than what it was. He had learned to read what the earth was already saying, to document what was already happening, to protect what was already working. The $3,000 field had become worth millions in documented resource value. But Merle had stopped measuring it that way a long time ago. He measured it in the water table data from the monitoring wells. He measured it in the young farmers who had stood in the field with their notebooks. He measured it in Cleet Warfield's cattle drinking through the worst drought in 50 years. He measured it in Harlan Bose's hand on his arm and the long-held weight of 3 generations finally released. He measured it in Patsy sitting across a kitchen table in the late hours, reading a notebook by lamplight, choosing to understand what her husband had seen. The most important things are rarely visible at the surface. The water knew this. The land knew this. It had taken Merle Keller 9 years to be able to say it plainly, and another 9 to find an audience that understood it. But water is patient. The earth is patient. And sometimes the most extraordinary things in the world are happening directly beneath our feet in the quiet dark, waiting for someone to stop and listen long enough to hear them.